In this video, I'm going to show you how to replace your brake rotors and pads on a 2004 Chevy 1500, because you don't want them looking like this because they squeal and you sound like an idiot. If your rotors don't look smooth, kind of like the backside of this, they'll actually be grooved, and that's when you know that your rotors are bad. So if you're not sure if it's your brakes that are actually the issue, you can run your hand down the backside of the rotor or just look at the front side of the rotor, and once again, it should be smooth. So you'll see a little bit of pitting on this one here, but for the most part, if you run your finger along it the opposite direction of the brake pads, that is smooth to the touch. Where on the backside here, this is kind of rough and it feels bumpy. Ultimately, that's not what you want. You want the brake pads riding on a smooth surface. So this one's from the other side and this one definitely needs to be changed. At this point, just follow along and I'll show you the steps on how to replace the pads on the driver's side. The first thing that you're gonna want to do is unscrew these caps if you have them. These just protect your lug nuts from getting rusted or nicked and knacked. This lug nut size is a 22 millimeter, so right here I have an impact, but you can also use a lug nut wrench or even just a ratchet and socket, but just loosen these. Now, if you have the tire still on the ground and you haven't jacked up the car yet, that would be the easiest time to actually use a lug nut wrench, but because we have it off the ground and an impact that's strong enough, I can just buzz them off easy. Next, you're going to want to take off the brake caliper bolts. Those are located in the backside, kind of near where the brake line comes down to the caliper. And those are an 18 millimeter. You can also get those off with a wrench or an impact as well. For this specific truck, there will actually be a long pin that also comes out with the bolt. Ultimately, the caliper slides on this pin, and that is supposed to be attached to the bolt. So make sure that that's either not broken and not rusted as well, because then it won't allow the caliper to slide properly. After you've taken out the caliper bolts, the caliper should slide right off of the pads. You might need to wedge something in the middle to pry it back, but you obviously don't want to take this out because the brake line is still attached. Just leave it up top for now, rest it the best you can. Make sure that this brake line that's rubber is not pinched and doesn't slice in any way. Ultimately, that needs to be a pressurized line and you need to keep it like that. You also want to make sure that it doesn't hang on that rubber hose because you don't want the stress on that hose. It'll probably break one of the fittings. So just rest it up top. That's the easiest way to do it. Now you're going to want to remove the brake pads as well as the brake bracket. So this is a bracket that goes all the way across the front here, and you're going to want to take the two bolts out of the back. Those are very close to where the caliper bolts are, and those are also 18 millimeter. So once you take the old pads out of the caliper, you're actually going to need to push back the piston. The reason for that is because the new pads will be a little thicker than the old pads. So in order to get the pads in and slide it over the rotor, you'll actually need these to be fully compressed back. You can actually use a few different tools for that. This is a brake caliper spreader tool, but you can also use a screwdriver or even a C-clamp and press back these two pistons here. So how I do that is using an old pad. You can just place that in place, and then I have the caliper spreader tool, but once again, if you have a screwdriver or even a C-clamp, you can use those as well. As I tighten on the brake caliper spreader tool, it compresses in the two pistons at once. And you might have to do this on both sides for this caliper specifically, just to make sure it goes down even. So this is another important thing to note. You can see that it's all wet on this side. That's actually because this piston inside the brake caliper is leaking. And so this is all brake fluid, and that's not what you want there. This should all be dry, kind of like this side is. You can see some surface rust, but there's no actual fluid coming down. That's what you want. This means that you have a bad caliper or bad piston within your caliper. This part in its entirety needs to be replaced. Now, while we're waiting on a new caliper to come in, I'm gonna show you what to do with the caliper bracket. There's two sliders that will be on the top and bottom of the bracket, and those will need to be replaced. So if you have a screwdriver, you might be able to just pop them right out. You can see it's coming out right there. And those will come off like so. Make sure you make note on how these go on. There's two different sizes of where they go. So when I pull it off, you'll see that this side's a little smaller than that side. You wanna make sure that the orientation of the sliders when you put the new ones on is correct to the old ones as well. If your brake caliper bracket is also rusty like this, you can just kind of touch it up with some sandpaper. This paint actually happens when you have a leaking brake system. So when brake fluid gets on paint, this is ultimately how much it destroys it. When sliding in the new sliders, sounds weird saying that, but they do kind of slide right in. Make sure that they click into place. So you don't want it popped up like that. You want it nice and flush. You can see how that is nice and flush with the bracket itself. After you're all set with the bracket, now it's time to actually prep the area with some anti-seize or never seize. This is pretty much a lubricant that will help your brakes from completely rusting out and ultimately increase the longevity of the parts that you're putting on the car. So there's a few spots that I would recommend putting this on, and one would be right inside here on the actual hub of the car. This prevents rusting around the hub and allows you to easily remove or put on a rotor in the future. On this specific part, you don't want the layer to be too thick. A nice thin layer of this Never Sees is perfect. And I'll link this product right down below in the description. This stuff's actually awesome. If you do brakes yourself more often than not, this stuff's actually a great buy. After that's all set, you can slide on the new rotor. Sometimes you can actually put Never Sees around the inside of this hub as well, so that when you push it on, it doesn't rust inside here, but that doesn't matter as much. At this point, now it's time to get the bracket ready, and you're gonna slide in the new pads. What I'll do now is mock this bracket into place. So I'll slide it in the back there and loosely put in the 2 bolts to hold it in. Once you're all set with that, now it's time to prep the brake pads. Now on the back of the brake pads, you're also going to want some Never Sees. It's important that you don't put it on the brake part side, and instead you put it on the back where there's actual protection. So I'm just gonna kind of slide some Never Sees around here. Once again, this prevents rusting. This allows your brake pads to kind of move evenly when you're pressing the brake pedal and ultimately increase the longevity of how long your brakes will last. And before you put the pads in, you actually want to put some Never Sees right on these sliders, and that will allow the sliders to be more slidey. I have noticed that these brake pads will come with squealers, they're called. This is something that will make a noise when your brake pads get low. And this one that only has one squealer goes on the front side of the rotor here. So you kind of angle it in. Sometimes the rotor likes to flop around when you're doing this, so I'm screwing on a lug nut and just tightening it up just so that the rotor kind of stays in place. Same with the backside pad. You're going to want to add some Never Sees to the back of this as well. Now it might be a little overkill, but if you live in New England like us and you want to prevent your car from rusting, this is the way to go. Now that the bracket is in place with the pads ready to go, I'm actually going to take the 18mm and tighten down, hand tight the back bolts to the bracket. I'll hit these bolts with an impact later, but right now I just want it to kind of stay in the right place. I'll take a quick moment now. If you haven't bought a Burnout Show t-shirt, go to burnoutshow.com/store. Check out t-shirts like this. We have a variety of different colors, so you can pick one that is not only a perfect fit, but also a sweet color as well. I'm going to take a quick moment now to tell you about the brake pads that were on this car. Now, brake pads are actually something that wear down and have a carbon-like dust when wearing. Once they wear all of the way, it begins to hit the iron plate that is behind it. So you can see this one here has 4 dots, and you can see the circles there. That is completely worn down and there's no more pad. Now, instead it is just metal grinding on metal. That's where you hear those scoring noises, loud screeches, or when you press the brake pedal, it actually feels like it's going up and down the pedal itself. However, this pad here has a lot of pad left on it. So you can see that it's kind of raised up from this actual iron metal piece with the hooks, and this has a lot of pad left. Your brakes, you want like this, and you don't want like this. This has been completely worn down, and you can see there's no more pad there. So it's just a little tech tip when looking at brakes or when you're taking off your brakes. It will tell you how much you have remaining. And when you go to a mechanic, they will look at the pad size, and they normally have a metric to tell you, oh, you might last about 15,000 miles, 10,000 miles or something like that. That's how they're able to gauge how much mileage you have left before it gets down to bare nothing and you need to change them. Now that we've received the new caliper, we've put it into place. Now remember that the brake pads specifically go on the sliders in a specific way. So make sure you have that in the right way, and then the caliper will slide with the pads over the rotor like so. Once you have that in place, then you just want to tighten down the 4 bolts that are in the back. Make sure you hit those with an impact and get those tight. Those are bolts that you certainly do not want loose. There's 2 final things when you're changing the brakes on your car, and one would be because you pressed the piston in the caliper all the way back, the first thing you want to do when you get in the car is actually pump the brake pedal probably about 5-6 times. You'll feel the pedal then get stiff. Don't just drive away, because if you put it in reverse and then you slam on the brakes, your car's not gonna stop because the pistons are not fully extended yet. So once again, fire up your car. In park, just pump the brake a few times. The second thing would be if you change the caliper, which we ended up changing today, it's important to bleed the brakes. Now we actually have another video I will link in the upper right corner on how to bleed brakes, but ultimately you don't want air in your brake lines. They are pressurized lines that rely on the pressure of the fluid to stop your car. So when you put in a new caliper, make sure that you bleed the fluid out the bleeder valve so that you make sure your car actually stops. Those are the two important things when touching your brakes. Obviously you don't want something to slip, and so make sure everything is tight and in the right spot before you start to drive the car. At this point, you're totally set and good to go. If you've reached this part where everything is tight, you're actually ready to slap on the tire, make sure the lug nuts are either torqued down to spec or super tight, and you are good to go. That's gonna be all for this video. Be sure to check out more videos on our channel like this that are tutorials that you can follow along with. These are simple driveway repairs. Things like brakes and oil changes are very easy to do with not that many tools nowadays. So be sure to check out the rest of our channel. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.